I've seen and commented on the march organized by Israel United in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. I wanted to offer a bit of the historical context which serves as background or a root of the display. I've seen some critics of Israel United in Christ describe the march as meaningless or pointless, or even wave it off as quote-unquote stupid. And therefore, I think it may be helpful to discuss the historical trend of which it is a part, as it has a design and an intended point. Throughout this history of the original group and the splinter groups, when the membership of a group made it possible, there were various attempts to put their numbers on display, both in their indoor festivals, like their Passover feast, as well as in various public marches or drills. For example, dating back to the early 90s, the precursor to the Hebrew Academy, which encompassed remedial academic subjects, doctrinal classes, physical training, rudimentary martial arts, and military drills, would sometimes conduct their exercises and marching drills outside in full public view. By 2004, the ICGJC's elaborate feasts and public marches got briefly shown in a segment on VH1.
The Black Israelites.
These splits and the subsequent splinter groups are fairly well known among those interested in the subject of One West descended Israelites. However, one split that's not much discussed is one which predated the Masha House of David split. That earlier minor split happened when a man called Abi Amalek broke away from the ICUPK. I mention this split because it has some relevance to the subject of the public displays of organization and numbers by the ICUPK. I do have an anecdote to share in this regard. It turns out that Abi Amalek broke away from the ICUPK, and there was a brief period in which he and perhaps a small band of men loyal to him would set up camp in Harlem. They would have their own camp separate from the ICUPK. Now, on at least one occasion, Abi Amalek's small camp was set up on a sidewalk preaching, and a much larger group from the ICUPK went and stood on that same sidewalk in opposition to Abi Amalek's camp. A larger group was out there to display their superior numbers. The point was for the ICUPK to draw attention to themselves. They were even telling interested pedestrians that Abi Amalek's group was, in their words, a counterfeit breakaway group. And they'd even quote the reference in Jeremiah 23:30 to the prophets who steal the Lord's word. As I said, I don't have any footage of that particular event, but the ICUPK was known for marching large numbers of members through Harlem to put their size and power on display. In this regard, consider, for example, a clip of members of GMS discussing precisely that practice.
Years ago, we called them missions. Like if somebody messed with a brother, we would call the whole school, all the camps. We were big back then. So you might have like 1,000 dudes, and we would march on motherfuckers, man. And we wouldn't do nothing. Well, whatever.
Just show the power that what can happen to your neighborhood.
And we would roll up on them and say, look, man, you see the Israelite brothers? Don't mess with no Israelite brothers. When you see the brothers on the table, don't fuck with no Israelite brothers, man. And niggas would back up.
Moreover, years later, the ICGJC continued the practice, with perhaps one of their most famous examples coming around 2005 in Philadelphia, when the ICGJC sent out a number of men to stand in opposition to the above-mentioned breakaway group called Light and Body Church. As was the case more than a decade prior with Abi Amalek's group in New York, the point here was to draw attention to themselves, to show their superior numbers, and to try to convince spectators that the smaller group was inferior or counterfeit or whatever. I guess in those days they were calling them antichrists, and perhaps they used the same language on Abi Amalek. Some speculated that the point of this exercise was to intimidate Light and Body Church, for the larger group to intimidate the smaller group, and perhaps even get into a fight. So therefore, it's probably worth noting that members of the ICGJC themselves later responded to such claims by noting that they never touched them and claiming that their only intention was to have a crowd of witnesses.
All the brothers that was in front of you was a great company of witnesses. That's it. Ain't nobody touch you niggas. So why you niggas acting like brothers was threatening you? It was just a big group of witnesses so brothers could see that you niggas are a bunch of hypocrites and liars. That's it.
The ICGJC would also display their numbers at their celebrations, at their feasts. For a certain period, in fact, their Passovers seemed to become ever larger, more organized, and more elaborate with each passing year. Perhaps their most impressive display came at their Passover in 2009. And it's also worth noting they would then post videos of those celebrations online to highlight their numbers and their organization. And I'd like to show a few clips from the Passovers of the ICGJC from 2008, from 2009, and from 2015, so the viewers might get a sense of this trend. So up first is their Passover from 2008. Here is their significantly more well-organized Passover from 2009. It seems to capture the pinnacle and zenith for the ICGJC.
One share journalist to 13 share journalists, please take the place. Bishops of boroughs and bishops of states, please take the place. Conference 42, Chief Priest, please take the place.
Now, take a look at their Passover from 2015, which seems to be an attempt to recapture and replicate the glory of their 2009 Passover.
Conference 42, Chief Priest, take your seats. Chief Priest, take your seats. Members of the Order of the 12 Apostles, take your seats. Members of the Order of the 12 Apostles, take your seats.
I devoted so much time in this video to the ICGJC for two reasons. First, because they were the largest group of One West groups. Second, and I think more relevant, because it seems to me that IUIC has clearly supplanted the ICGJC as the largest group. In fact, I would add that IUIC seems to have even adopted some of the ICGJC's patterns of organization and uniformity, though perhaps in a more prudent and disciplined way. It should be pointed out that this history of displays of numbers and organization actually predates the One West groups. It predates the ICUBK, going back to the Nation of Islam. In fact, when back in the early 90s, when the old ICUBK was beginning to march large groups of men through Harlem and these sorts of displays, the Nation of Islam was already well known for having done such. In fact, it's in the early 90s that a famous example of such from the NOI was depicted in a major film, that being the police station scene in Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X. Such displays, and this is worth noting, such displays have a point. And insofar that the numbers, the organization, the display of discipline and apparent strength, the sense of belonging to something meaningful, all of this appeals to certain young men who are searching for something. And with that, I'm going to close this video with the relevant scene of the aforementioned Spike Lee film.